Sun slices the dawn like a razor, while hoofbeats shatter Tasmania's mist. Beneath a roaring silver waterfall, young Mia lies motionless, a glowing white bridle cinched to her wrist like a frayed lifeline. Whisper, the uncanny horse who senses the pull of suicide, kneels his breath, forging rainbows from spray. Jacob, a war-scarred veteran who thought tears were spent, collapses. His sobs merge with the cascade, drumming a heart back to life. Then Whisper nods one sacred tilt that bends destiny and ignites hope in the darkest abyss. If this moment touches your heart, subscribe now so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspirational stories. The valley at first light feels older than language, a bowl of pale ash cradled by the ragged ridges of central Tasmania. Mist swims between skeletal gums like restless milk, thick enough to swallow sound, yet thin enough that each breath carries the taste of damp earth and the metallic ghost of last night's frost. Nothing moves. Then from somewhere deep inside the chalky veil, a single hoofbeat breaks the silence. A hollow wooden thump that echoes off unseen canyon walls and rebounds inside the chests of anyone close enough to feel it. Another follows. Then another. Soon the pulse grows deliberate, a slow, deliberate drum roll, marching toward revelation, daring the valley to remember that life never holds still for long, however fiercely grief may wish it. A sliver of pasture emerges as the fog parts, revealing the weather-beaten timber beams of an old training pen. There, hanging from a rusted nail driven into the crossbeam back when the world felt simpler, dangles a bridle bleached nearer to bone than canvas. It twists lazily, responding to currents no eye can see, its frayed leather reins crossing the air like the swing of a pendulum counting down. With each rotation, the buckle kisses the post, a faint metallic tap that lands perfectly between heartbeat and breath, so the mind confuses it for its own pulse. The leather glimmers white, catching what little dawn light leaks through the mist, and every glimmer feels like a question. What moment should this tether hold, and what moment must it release? Beyond the fence, a herd of stock horses fades into view. Silhouettes draped in morning vapor. They stand in a crescent, with their rumps turned toward the pen door, heads lowered as if paying silent tribute to something too sacred for mortal eyes. Muscles twitch beneath their coats, but none dare turn. All except one. In the center of the living arc, chestnut hide veined with muscle, a single blaze of ivory running the length of his mane stands. Whisper, tall and motionless, neck arched the way cathedral arches frame stained glass. Every breath he exhales hangs visible for a heartbeat, before dissolving as though time itself hesitates to erase evidence that something remarkable just occurred. Unseen by the equine congregation, 3 human witnesses clutch the rails of the outer paddock. They arrived separately in the gray hour before dawn, drawn by memories their therapists warned would hurt to revisit. Ron Devlin, 54, skin weathered by decades at sea, fingers locked into a fisherman's knot of scarred knuckles, swallows against a rising tide only he can sense. Last winter he imagined the Tasman sea swallowing him whole. One step forward off a foaming cliff would have erased every ledger of debt, every echo of an empty house. But Whisper found him first blocking the path with an authority sailors reserved for storms, forcing Ron to kneel in the sand and sob until the self-loathing washed clean. To Ron's right stands Harper Cruz, 22 eyes rimmed violet from too many nights negotiating with sleep that refused to show. She presses a damp sleeve across her mouth, anxious to keep her breathing from disturbing the fragile hush. Months earlier, she had carved the inside of her forearm with surgical precision, waiting for relief in crimson promise. Relief never came, only vertigo and regret, until Whisper nosed open the infirmary door, laid his chin on her lap, and lent her a silence so profound it drowned the scream inside her head. At the far end of the rail, Salvatore Sala Leone, 38, an ex-army medic, shifts weight onto an oak cane carved with initials he will never spell out loud. He smells iodine in the mist, though none exists, and assures himself the copper in the air is not blood. The night he met Whisper, the stallion blocked the mountain road like a checkpoint, installed by fate forcing Sala's truck to break inches from the gorge where he planned to plunge. The horse's stillness, that impossible calm, dismantled war inside him with the stealth of a field surgeon. Since then, Sala measures safety by the animal's breath. Ron's pulse punches his throat. Harper's knees threaten to fold. Sala tightens his grip on the cane until bone flashes white. None know why they returned, only that a dream woke each before first light. A bridle suspended in an empty barn, spinning like a compass needle that cannot decide what north means. They followed that image here, chasing the whisper of a whisper. The bridle creaks again. Whisper exhales one long, deliberate breath that condenses like smoke. Then, without warning, he inclines his head in a subtle nod. The gesture is barely perceptible, yet it sends current through the pasture. The herd shifts attention, snapping toward the fence as if gravity reversed. Ron feels tears ignite behind his eyes. Harper's shoulders jerk once a quiet convulsion where memory collides with miracle. Salah's cane slips. He steadies himself by planting it deeper into the mud. The nod hangs in memory long after Whisper stills, but its ripple marches forward, unavoidable. Over the rails, Harper finds Ron's gaze. In that unplanned collision, they share proof that grief recognizes itself in a stranger and does not avert its eyes. She wipes tears angrily, ashamed of their sincerity, yet they fall anyway. Ron extends his hand, not touching, simply letting it hover, palm up, as though inviting a wounded bird to rest. The distance between their fingers shrinks until it might as well be a bridge. Salah watches, jaw clenched, jaw fired by envy. He will never confess. Healing is a messy privilege, he thinks, and some men trip over it without deserving. Yet even envy crumbles beneath the stallion's stillness. Whisper's ears swivel forward, tracking something no human will ever measure: a wind shift, the release of a held breath, perhaps the hush of a thought stepping back from a ledge. Whatever it is, he hears, decides, accepts. Then, Whisper lifts his right forehoof and sets it down with surgical precision, the way a conductor raises a baton to summon an overture. The thud is soft, but in the hush it feels mountainous. The bridle stops spinning. It hangs perfectly still, as though time itself pauses to listen. Harper drops to her knees. Wet grass soaks her jeans, cold biting toward bone. But she remains, hands pressed together beneath her chin. Not a prayer exactly, more a plea that the universe not retract whatever mercy it just extended. Ron follows the crack of arthritic joints, loud in the quiet. His coat smells of brine. He lays a hand on her shoulder with the gentleness of rain past midnight. Tears fall threading into the fabric of her jacket like seeds. Salah stands held erect by pride and the myth that soldiers do not beg. Yet pride softens. He bows his head, surrendering the story that pain must finish only one way. Whisper watches them all, another breath leaving his nostrils like a magician's scarf. The herd, sensing the shift, begins to turn one by one, heads swiveling, ears aligning toward the humans. No snorts of alarm, just curiosity. The valley tilts, energy funneling to where human sorrow meets equine silence. Without instruction, Ron, Harper, and Salah rise, their backs collecting dew where knees pressed earth moments before. They step forward, closing the gap between fence and field. Whisper does not retreat. He stands sentinel at the threshold, gatekeeper, an oracle in equal measure. Harper considers climbing the rails, but stops, remembering that want is not the same as need. Reverence must be observed. What saves you owns a sliver of you thereafter. Ron speaks first, voice rough. Thank you, he says, though whether he addresses the horse, the dawn, or the shapeless force that braided the two into a lifeline is unclear. Harper echoes him, voice no louder than a sob. Salah clears his throat, but gratitude refuses language. The white bridle remains inert, yet its presence feels louder than the hoofbeats that announce this tableau. It gleams with an authority that makes scholars of us all lecturing on the fragile film between survival and surrender. No one touches it. They do not need to. Every soul now wears an invisible version across its own wrist, a reminder of the moment the knot slipped loose. Yet before the mundane can reclaim dominion, Whisper offers one last motion. He tilts his head again, almost imperceptibly, a benediction without parchment or seal. Within that nod lives everything, the narrow edge of despair, the unseen tether that catches falling hearts, the certainty that someone keeps watch when night devours the horizon. Then stillness returns. The stallion closes his eyes, accepting dawn as a priest accepts confession, and the scene exhales softer than it began. 7 minutes have passed, though nobody standing there would believe it. Time stretched, knelt, prayed, and stood again beside them, transformed. When the sun finally clears the last tendrils of mist, it catches the bridle, and the white leather flashes a silent promise on this ground. Hearts may tremble, but they will not break. Whisper opens his eyes. The herd resumes grazing, and life, uncertain, miraculous, defiant, walks forward on 4 quiet hooves. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the future inhales, waiting, listening, knowing that every heartbeat born of fear might yet be steadied by the silent nod of a horse called Whisper again. Morning fog still clung to the paddock, when the rattle of an approaching engine sliced through the hush that Whisper had left behind. Gravel spat from the ranch roadstones, skittering like startled beetles, until an SUV emerged its headlights, carving twin tunnels through gray vapor. The vehicle rolled to a stop beside the weather-scarred barn, and for a heartbeat, creatures watched it exhale steam as though the machine itself needed to learn the valley's slower pulse. A door opened, and a pair of polished city shoes met the muddy ground, sinking slightly before steadying. Dr. Hannah Park's straightened, slender frame wrapped in a charcoal coat, ebony hair pinned in a bun that broadcast efficiency. In her right hand, she carried a slim black case, no longer than a violin, but heavier with untested questions. Inside the ranch house, Mia Quinn crouched on the hardwood floor of the spare bedroom that served as her refuge. The 15-year-old had dragged curtains closed against dawn, allowing only a knife-thin beam of light to fall across a canvas taped to the wall. In charcoal, she carved another corridor of trees, their canopies meshing like ribs around a throat. Every stroke deepened the forest. Every smear of shadow dimmed the possibility of an exit. She worked quickly, fingers stained to the wrist, lips parted in concentration. Somewhere in the unfinished distance, a tiny silhouette already waited, neither fully human nor entirely phantom, its back turned as if ashamed of existing. She named the figure Nothing. Names were promises, and promises disappointed. Mia listened for hoofbeats she could trust, but the only sound reaching her was graphite scraping paper like branches scratching a coffin lid. Jacob Mercer stood on the porch shoulder, braced against a cedar post engraved with years of restless pacing. He watched the SUV disgorge its cargo and felt the prickle of old war instincts crawling along his spine. The former infantry sergeant measured threats by weight gait and gaze. The woman who had just arrived carried herself like someone who believed time could be forced to obey laboratory schedules. He tightened his fist around the white bridle looped through his hand. Whisper's retired tack bleached by weather and prayer. Leather creaked against calloused skin. Across the yard, unseen by her, he rolled the metal bit between thumb and knuckle the way some men roll rosary beads, reminding himself that rituals keep demons outside the gate. In the stall behind him, the stallion shifted but made no sound as though trusting Jacob to guard the threshold. "Mr. Mercer," Hannah called, voice clean and neutral in the moist air. She approached with confident strides, shoes leaving crisp impressions that would disappear before noon. Jacob dipped his chin in almost salute, though he offered no smile. Instead, he waited, letting silence expose intentions. Hannah's gaze flicked to the bridle, lingered, then returned to his weathered face. "I appreciate you allowing me to observe," she continued. "Everything will remain non-invasive. I'm here to collect neuroelectromagnetic profiles, nothing more." Her diction was polished marble. Each consonant carried academic authority. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he said, voice gravel thick, "this place ain't a lab, and that horse ain't a specimen." He angled the bridle behind his leg as if shielding a child from a camera flash. "You watch respectful, fine. But understand, the moment he so much as flinches, your gadgets are done." Hannah mentally filed the hostility under environmental variables human. During residency, she had treated veterans whose startle reflex detonated at the clang of a cafeteria tray. Yet Mercer's silence felt more combustible than their shouted threats. She inhaled deliberately, tasting eucalyptus sap and the faint musk of horse sweat bleeding from the barn's cedar planks. Adjusting the weight of her case, she reminded herself why she was here. Inside lay twin halo sensors lined with gold microelectrodes able to sample cortical oscillations through a horse's forelock. If Whisper truly detected suicidal ideation, those signals would ripple through limbic circuits, leaving signatures she could map, quantify, and publish. Proof finally that empathy could be traced, not merely told. Across the yard, the ranch landscape looked archaic, as though modernity had stumbled into folklore. Hannah felt a twinge of fear that data might drown in myth. Fear she decided was evidence she still respected the unknown. A floorboard creaked overhead. Both adults looked up as Mia pushed the front door open, charcoal fingerprints smearing the brass knob. Sunlight now stronger framed her slight figure like a backlit photograph, doomed to overexposure. She wore an oversized hoodie sprinkled with faded galaxies. Its sleeves hung past her fingertips, frayed into tassels. Charcoal streaks slashed across her cheek, accidental war paint that refused to look deliberate. Her gaze flicked from the bridle gripped in Jacob's fist to the black case in Hannah's hand, registering threat in both, then retreated behind pupils dark as cave water. Jacob softened. "Morning, kiddo," he murmured, voice pitched for wary colts. Mia answered with a nod so slight it might have been a shiver. Hannah tried a smile. "Hi, Mia. I'm Dr. Park. When you're ready, I'd love to see your drawings." The girl's shoulders made a fractional hitch flinch or shrug before she slipped past them and headed toward the barn, bare feet silent on damp earth. Hannah watched the teenager vanish between fence slats painted by years of rain. Wonder multiplied behind her corneal glare. How long had the girl been here? What screening protocols existed? She opened a notepad, but Jacob's voice cut across the air. "She's not a subject," he said, reading her intention like field orders. "You ask her permission proper. You wait for yes or no. And you leave her sketchbook alone unless she hands it over." His drawl carried iron beneath civility. Hannah tucked the pad away. "Of course," she replied, opting for diplomacy. "My interest is the horse Mr. Mercer. The child's well-being is truly paramount." The words sounded rehearsed even to her, but they were true. She had lost one patient in residency, a boy whose silent sadness had slipped through every quantitative metric. She vowed never to miss another signal, whether it flickered in EEG waves or the dart of a pupil. Still, the bridle in his hand fascinated her, a relic guarding unspoken data. Jacob shifted weight, rolling onto the leg that still carried shrapnel the army surgeons hadn't bothered digging out. Pain pinched his mouth, but he refused to show it. He lifted the bridle fingers, brushing the white leather almost tenderly. "See this?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Was once brown as river mud. But the sun, the rain, the salt of people's tears, it bleached it pure. That's how you know a thing has felt too much." He ran a thumb across the metal bit, and Hannah glimpsed scars on his knuckles, thin silver vines testifying to past explosions. "Whisper won't wear it anymore," he continued, "so I carry it instead. Reminds me nothing gentle stays gentle by accident." Behind them, the barn door thudded. Mia had slipped inside. Jacob's eyes tracked her shadow. "The kid sees different," he said. "Draws the places pain hides when it thinks no one's looking." He looked at Hannah square. "You really think your wires can see like she does?" Inside the barn, shafts of light speared dusty air, and motes danced like falling stars around Mia as she approached the stall. Whisper turned his head one ear, rotating first, then the other, a monarch acknowledging a courtier. The girl pressed her palm to the gate latch, but did not open it. Instead, she let her fingers trace the grain, listening to the creak of wood, the way a doctor listens to lungs. Her charcoal-stained nails looked like claws against pine. She whispered something no one outside could catch the words, and the stallion chuffed warm breath rolling across her knuckles. Invisible current passed between them, a silent morse of tremors in muscle and heartbeat. Mia unclipped a stub of pencil from behind her ear, sketching lines in the thin dust atop the gate, 4 trees arched like guardians, and a smaller figure kneeling before them. When she finished, Whisper exhaled and dust swirled, erasing the drawing as if agreeing to secrecy. Back outside, Hannah adjusted the glasses perched on her nose and caught the flicker of Mia's shadow moving inside the barn slats. She raised a small handheld thermal imager, purely instinct, but before the screen could bloom, Jacob's hand closed over her wrist. His grip was firm, not violent, but it transmitted an unarguable boundary. Eyes that had once scanned IED-littered roads now pierced hers. "I said respectful," he reminded, voice barely above the hiss of dew evaporating on metal. Hannah's heart stuttered. The heat of his palm lingered. "Observation only," she murmured, lowering the device. Jacob nodded once, perhaps in thanks, perhaps in warning. The bridle swung at his side like a pendulum measuring faith. In that hush, Hannah realized her study's success depended on earning consent, not just from a veteran and a horse, but from their scars, visible and hidden. Science, she thought, might need to kneel here before it could stand. Hannah set the case on a fence rail and snapped it open. 2 halo sensors, copper arcs, bending toward each other, gleamed like technological halos. Jacob leaned in. "Crown of thorns," he muttered. "Only if it hurts," she said. "They only listen." His fingers hovered, then retreated. Listening can wound. Whisper took on people's storms, turned his tack white. Wire him up, chart the lightning. But what happens when tourists queue for salvation? Hannah shut the lid. Conference halls and funding pitches flickered across her mind. She swatted them away. "If this proves real, it safeguards him," she said. Jacob studied her long enough for mist to thin between them. Finally, he extended the bridle, not offering, only allowing contact. She touched the sun-bleached leather. Warmth pulsed through her fingertips as though the horse's heart beat inside the strap. In that moment, she knew permission was less a yes than a charge to protect what science could never fully claim. Dust hung inside the training barn, the way incense clings to a chapel after Mass, drifting in lazy braids through rafters dark with age. Late morning sunlight squeezed through warped slats, slicing the haze into glowing bars that hovered above the packed earth floor. Every breath tasted of cedar sweat and something older, an iron memory of storms whose thunder had long since rolled out to sea. The stillness was thick enough to convince sound to stay outside thick enough that each mote of dust seemed to float on the hush like pollen searching for a season. Mia Quinn stood motionless in that hush, her sockless toes curling against earth still cool from dawn. A sheet of heavyweight paper shook between her fingers, charcoal streaking its edges like burned feathers. Hours earlier, she had filled the page with a corridor of trees pitched so tightly together that daylight never touched the path beneath. At the far end, she had scratched a lone silhouette, back turned, shoulders bowed, disappearing into black. Now, with graphite smudged up her wrists and a pulse hammering in her throat, she wondered if the figure on the paper was walking away or being swallowed. On the other side of the half-door, whispers shifted. He had stood statuesque for so long, the dust had settled on his mane. But the girl's stillness unsettled him. Smooth muscle rippled beneath chestnut coat, sending a shiver through the haze. His ears pricked forward while nostrils widened to capture scent that was more emotion than odor, salt tears, brittle adrenaline, the faint static hum of thoughts sliding toward a cliff. He inhaled, head lowering, until the white blaze of his forehead aligned with her eye level, and for one fragile instant, they breathed the same air. Then he moved. One measured step carried 1,000 pounds of bone and sinew forward with the delicacy of a violinist lifting a bow. The hoof came down flat, no scraping, no hesitant tap, just a firm declaration that space had changed ownership. Dust hopped, danced, settled again. Whisper's second step followed, then a third, closing the distance until only the gate hardware separated horse and girl. He halted, breath rhythm, steady eyes deep and liquid. The heat rising off his hide touched her cheeks before she admitted she was trembling. A tremor flickered behind Mia's eyes, opening a trap door to memories she guarded with sleepless vigilance. She was 10 again, lying beneath her bedroom window, while paramedics outside whispered through radios that nobody should let the little girl see her mother carried out on a stretcher. She was 12, scribbling Gothic trees down the margin of a history exam, while the counselor repeated her name 3 times before she realized class had ended. She was 14, standing beside a river's railing, a dusk pocket heavy with polished stones debating gravity. The trapdoor slammed, but its echo remained vibrating in her ribs. Her lungs forgot their sequence. She raised her gaze and the world narrowed to the twin eclipses of his eyes, vast, starless, absorbing every reflection she threw at them. She saw grief there, not his, but hers, projected back with the clarity of a mirror held too close. Fingers tightened on the drawing. The paper crackled where charcoal still drying crumbled along a tree trunk. Whisper's ears twitched, once soft triangles adjusting, as though tuning to a station just beyond human frequency. His breath brushed the gate latch, and her heartbeat stumbled, trying to keep pace with silence. Without warning, Whisper stamped. The impact thundered up Mia's shins, before reverberating through rib and spine, rattling memories she had buried beneath layers of silence. It sounded like a door slammed inside her chest. Dust exploded outward, spinning into knotted whirls that resembled dark galaxies before dispersing. The stall beams creaked in sympathetic resonance. Mia's vision blurred not from fear, but from water rising fast behind her eyes, faster than she could blink away. Charcoal on her fingertips smeared as palms slicked with sweat. She shook her head as if denying oxygen. Whisper stamped again, a half-inch closer to the gate toe, digging into earth to punctuate the statement. Mia's throat contracted. The first sob escaped like air escaping a punctured tire, high, thin, involuntary. Her right hand opened, releasing the drawing. Gravity flipped it twice before it landed face up on a mound of straw. The shadow trees looked smaller from the floor, less menacing, almost fragile. Seeing them diminished broke whatever dam remained. Tears surged, hot, relentless. Whisper exhaled a low tremor. Part sigh, part subterranean rumble. Mia staggered backward, thighs colliding with a wooden sawhorse. She pivoted and fled, shoulders hunched as though dodging unseen arrows. Straw hissed beneath her feet. The barn door slammed outward, flooding her path with too bright daylight. She sprinted across the yard, arms wrapped around her ribs, sobs hitching her breath. Behind her, the stallion remained inside the threshold, but his gaze stretched after her like a lifeline, unwilling to snap. Outside, Dr. Hannah Park stood under the lean-to roof sleek sensor rig, balanced in both hands. Hearing the commotion, she angled the array toward the barn. Fingertip pressed a toggle. Green LEDs winked awake and antennae began sampling the electromagnetic soup that wrapped every brain in silent aurora. She caught only a glimpse of Mia, bolting past smudged face, feral panic before her screen lit with erratic spikes. Simultaneously, spectral contours mapped the stall beyond the doorway, pulsing crimson where the horse stood breathing history. Hannah's pulse raced. Data points climbed in jagged surges, cresting higher than anything recorded in controlled trials. She stepped forward, sensor lifted hungry to capture the ghost inside the numbers. The barn doorframe already bracketed her view when a broad arm swept across her path. Jacob Mercer materialized from fog and sawdust, white bridle looped around his fist. With economy born of battlefields, he placed his body between scientist and stallion. The move contained no violence, only the certainty of unarguable borders. Hannah tried to shift left. Jacob mirrored. She raised the sensor. He raised the bridle, the pale leather glowing like a warning flare. No words passed, but language crackled in eye contact. Her shoulders squared, telegraphing urgency. Lives might depend on readings like these. His brow furrowed, broadcasting an older code. Lives depended first on respect. The sensor chimed a proximity alert, graphs redlining. Hannah's thumb hovered over the record icon. Jacob's forearm flexed, veins standing like roots against bark. In the yard behind them, Mia collapsed to her knees, hands covering her face. Her sobs rose in jagged bursts that fluttered sparrows from a nearby fence. Whisper answered with a soft nicker, barely audible. Yet it traveled across the air and found her ears. She did not turn, but her spine bent, as though the call removed weight. Hannah saw the transformation in peripheral vision. Jacob saw it too. He dropped his gaze to the girl, proof that pain required presence, not probes. The stalemate broke. Hannah powered the device down. LEDs faded. The sensor went slack in her grip. A breath she did not notice holding hissed from her lungs. Jacob lowered the bridle relief, hidden behind stoic composure. He pointed with his chin toward Mia. Hannah nodded, acknowledging that her priority had shifted. Neither thanked the other. The moment did not belong to gratitude, but to surrender. He strode toward the girl boots, silently parting dew-weighted grass. Hannah stayed back, letting the yard rewrite her intentions. Inside the barn, Whisper edged forward until sunlight brushed his muzzle, then halted. His dark eyes lingered on the abandoned drawing. Dust still drifted in the air, illuminated like distant constellations. With a breath deep enough to lift his chest, he nudged the drawing once, sending it sliding across straw, until it came to rest against the barn wall. A clean tear had formed down the center, splitting trunk from canopy, opening the forest to a sliver of imagined sky. He stood over that small wound, as if guarding its right to heal. Wind coursed through gum trees, flipping leaves so their silvery undersides winked at the sun. A wedge-tailed eagle wheeled once and vanished. Sheep bells chimed beyond the ridge, proof that ordinary life kept moving. Jacob knelt beside Mia, wordless, shielding her with his back until tremors eased. Hannah rested the darkened rig on a fence rail, palms open to the dirt, accepting limits. For a long spell, no one spoke. Whisper's breathing drifted from the barn, steady as surf, and the three listened, letting those waves fold over grief and pull it slowly back from shore. Sunlight spread across the yard like paint, warming each footprint. The valley's afternoon light bled slowly into copper as Jacob led Dr. Hannah Park and Mia toward the outer ring of paddocks, where the young stock horses roamed the slope like flickers of living ember. The hush that usually guarded Whisper's domain had altered, collecting a different gravity, as though the air itself were holding its breath in anticipation of an arrival. It already recognized the way a crowd leans forward moments before a bow strikes the first note of an overture. They were almost to the south gate, when a single whistle, low and hollow, spiraled through the gum trees. It fluttered like an indigenous wooden flute, yet carried a command that only hooves could truly hear. From the hillside, a roan gelding lifted its head. Then another bay mare followed, and soon a small tide of horses rippled downslope toward the sound, forming a crescent near the creek bed, where the willow roots drank deep. The source of the whistle emerged seconds later, a young man wearing earth-toned canvas trousers, a sleeveless shirt, the color of wet sand, and a necklace of seed pods that rattled softly against his collarbone. Koa Talbot walked barefoot, each footfall kissing the dust with reverence. Mia noticed he carried no rope, no crop, no halter. Only a carved eucalyptus branch, polished by years of handling its surface, etched with geometric grooves that caught light like rivulets in sand. He raised the branch once more and exhaled a second whistle that wasn't blown, but woven. The sound originated deep in his diaphragm, traveled up the chambers of his chest, and escaped through pursed lips with such steady tone that Jacob felt it settle in the cartilage between his ribs. Koa Jacob called in greeting voice, a notch softer than usual. The barefooted man tipped his chin, neither deferential nor aloof, a gesture carved from the same courtesy the land extends to rain. Before Jacob could speak again, Koa shifted his attention to Whisper. He pressed 2 fingers to his own sternum, then opened the hand toward the stallion in a slow arc, like unfurling parchment. The horse answered with a low, chesty rumble, more thunder than nicker. Mia held her breath. Her fingertips tingled with electricity that no storm cloud had conjured. Hana, already powering up a compact audio recorder clipped to her jacket pocket, leaned sideways to capture the frequency of the whistle, but the device sputtered feedback. She frowned, tapped the mic cage, and tried again. Jacob noticed, but before he could issue a warning about tech and boundaries, Koa's eyes flicked toward the recorder. He smiled, not accusingly, more like someone recognizing a child trying to capture fireflies in a jar too small to grant them flight. "Sound travels crooked in this place, Doc," he said, voice carrying the coastal inflection of Palauakani blended with mainland slang. "Your machine won't find its straight line." His English was crisp, yet rhythmic consonants softened at the edges. Hana started to respond, then stopped, realizing no polite retort existed that wouldn't reduce his comment to folklore. Instead, she clicked the device off and slid it into her backpack. Mia glanced between the adults, gauging tension as she might gauge weather before a storm. Whisper nudged her elbow, with his muzzle stirring strands of her hair across her cheek. The contact grounded her with the immediacy of instinct. Tears that earlier flooded her vision were now dry salt dams under her eyes. She raised a tentative hand and let it rest against Whisper's cheekbone. He stilled under the weight of her touch. Koa observed the exchange and stepped closer until he shared the stallion's breath. He reached into a pocket sewn onto the thigh of his trousers and withdrew 3 palm-sized river stones, each painted with ochre sigils, a spiraling nautilus, a horizon line broken by sun rays, and a figure of 8 distorted into the shape of an infinity symbol. He placed them on the ground in an inverted triangle point aimed at Whisper's chest. The stallion lowered his head, nostrils flaring, to read the stones as one might read the scent of distant rain. "What's he doing?" Mia whispered, words barely audible. Jacob knelt beside her, voice pitched equally low. "That's Warluwara breathwork. He studied with Auntie Melina up in Tiagara. It's how they speak to country and to horses." Mia nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She felt the explanation rather than heard it, warmth curling behind her sternum like embers reigniting. Koa kept breathing in measured rhythms until Whisper matched the cadence rib cage, rising and falling in synchronous waves. Only then did Koa speak for the group. "This place," he said, eyes sweeping the open acreage, "is older than the fences that pretend to tame it. Back in Dreamtime, the hoofed one roamed these ridges, carrying stories on his mane. People near the cliffs heard those stories in the thunder of his gallop. Whenever someone's spirit grew brittle and thought about leaping, the hoofed one arrived, pressing his breath against their chest until the cliff forgot its hunger." Mia imagined such a creature, monumental, silent hope incarnate. She remembered the silhouette in her drawing, standing before trees too dense for dawn. Maybe Dreamtime existed. Wherever sorrow convinced itself there were no exits. Koa crouched to retrieve the stones. Dust clung to his calves. He continued those saved souls, painted the hoofed one's prints along the gorge walls with ochre and blood. Generations later, kids trace those shapes with their fingers when they learn about holding on. He offered the nautilus stone to Mia. She took it gingerly. Its surface felt warmer than sunlight. Hana cleared her throat. Data may have been silenced, but curiosity would not. "I've read Dreamtime stories," she began carefully, but never one that explicitly references horses. Equines arrived here with colonial Jacob, shot her a brief but sharp look, cautioning she tread lightly. Koa, however, smiled again, amused rather than offended. "The hoofed one isn't exactly a horse or a kangaroo or anything separate," he explained. "He's movement itself, shaped like whatever spirit most needs. Right now, he looks a lot like your friend in the barn." The words made sense to Mia, in a place syntax couldn't reach. She hugged the stone to her chest. Whisper flicked an ear, acknowledging even that silent gesture. Koa's smile dipped toward sadness. Problem is, he said, gaze drifting past them toward the main road, folks in town still think Dreamtime belongs behind museum glass. My people can shovel manure, break colts for rodeo, but the moment we say something medicine can't measure, we get labeled ghost talkers. He flexed the eucalyptus stick between his palms. It sighed under tension, but did not snap. We know animals carry story, carry sorrow, carry instructions. White fellas write papers about serotonin spikes. We just listen to breath. Jacob sucked a breath between his teeth, more apology than inhale. He opened his palm, showing the white bridle draped across the lines of his hand. "This is the only scalp I carry," he said quietly. Words aimed at Koa, but audible to everyone. "It's not mine to own either. Just trying to protect what I can't understand." Hana felt heat climb her cheeks. Academic detachment suddenly felt like a shield hammered from tin, easily dented by stories older than her degrees. Still, she needed footholds. If Whisper senses ideation, she ventured it may produce measurable field potentials, which could lead to Koa raised a finger, polite, but firm. "Doc, maybe the job isn't capturing his sense. Maybe it's honoring it. Some medicine doesn't translate into voltage." He tapped his own chest twice. When breath aligns with heart, no graph is necessary. Silence descended thicker than the earlier hush, but less oppressive. It felt collaborative, as though everyone were weaving the same tapestry, each thread essential. In that moment, Whisper exhaled a burst of air so forceful it rattled the barn door's hinges. Hana's skin pimpled under the gust. Jacob's knuckles whitened around the bridle. Mia pressed the nautilus into her palm until the spiral imprinted her skin anew. Koa tilted his head, listening, then echoed the stallion with a short, breathy huff. The sound passed through everyone like a pulse, resetting arrhythmic hearts. Koa broke the trance first. He rose, brushed grit from his knees, and offered the infinity stone to Hana. "For your study," he said. "Not to dissect, just to keep near your machines, so they remember humility." She accepted with both hands, fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. The symbol's curved lines met at 2 points, yet never fused a warning that connection demands distance too. With formalities concluded, Koa stepped back, whistled 3 bright notes, and the horses beyond the fence wheeled as one, galloping toward an open pasture where sunlight pooled. The rhythmic thunder receded, echoing against hillsides like applause. The foal that had lain down moments earlier rose and followed legs, wobbling, but determined. Dust spiraled into the air, briefly painting the sky amber. Mia watched them go, heart-thudding, not in fear, but promise. She slid the nautilus stone into the pouch of her hoodie and whispered, "Thank you," though it was unclear to whom. Hana pocketed the infinity symbol, documenting the moment in mental ink rather than digital. Jacob offered Koa a nod, weighted with respect, once reserved for platoon leaders. Koa returned the nod, eyes reflecting sky-earth and something fluid between them that could not be charted. He walked away barefoot, following the herd, yet veering uphill toward the tree line, disappearing among iron barks, as if the land opened a door solely for him. The eucalyptus staff left faint footprints in the grass that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared, like ink soaked into parchment before it can be read. Whisper nudged Mia softly, urging her to unclench fingers from around her own ribs. Jacob eased the white bridle over his shoulder, feeling its weight lighten somehow. Hana glanced down at the stone in her palm. In the center of the infinity loop, a fleck of gold mica caught the sun, sending a single spark skyward, a data point of its own, but one her graphs could never parse. The breeze carried a promise none could yet name or measure fully. The moon hid behind ragged clouds, leaving the ranch lit only by a faint spill of starlight and the amber bulb that burned beside the back door. Inside the spare bedroom, Mia Quinn sat cross-legged on the floorboards, back against the narrow bed that smelled of cedar and washed linen. Everyone else slept, or pretended to. She kept every sense tuned for footsteps, hinges, any question. She did not wish to answer. Her phone lay face down on the plank beside a chipped mug, half full of cold tea. A single camping lantern glowed in the corner, its blue flame haloing the room with a tremor just bright enough to reveal the blank sheet taped to the wardrobe. She had stolen the paper from the studio drawer after dinner, tucking it under her hoodie like contraband. Now she lifted a crimson pastel, brand new, still wrapped, and peeled the label with her teeth. Her fingertips already shone with charcoal crescents from earlier sketches, but tonight demanded color, the shade of warning. She pressed pastel to paper and dragged a jagged streak downward, then another, until a thorny passage bled across the sheet. At each intersection, she stabbed brighter red tiny embers glowing inside darkness. They resembled bushfire footage she replayed on her cracked laptop, pillars of flame, twisting above treetops, sparks spinning like galaxies, the roar so loud it dissolved language. Fire solved the arithmetic of living. It took a body and turned it into light. When the composition felt balanced, she stepped back, bare soles whispering against cold timber. The image pulsed in lantern glow, blob of red, tunnel of black, a narrowing mouth that swallowed everything beyond. She wrapped her arms around her shins and rested her chin on her knees, staring until the path seemed to bulge outward, beckoning. She tried to imagine what the first lick of flame would feel like, whether nerves fired one last time as skin crisped, whether pain outran consciousness. A dull thud rattled the window. She jerked toward the sound. Another followed, heavier, resonating through glass and wood. This was no branch caught by wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. She crossed to the curtains. Through a crack she saw Whisper outside Maine, ghosting in the breeze. The stallion stood so near the veranda railing, cast stripes across his withers like prison bars. His right foreleg lifted and slammed ground again. Dust puffed moonlight, catching each grain. Whisper's ears twitched. He swung his head toward her as if sensing the vibration. Their eyes met through warped glass. In his gaze she felt every late-night panic, where fingernails carved crescents into forearms, every walk to the ridge, where cliffs broke the sea, every secret search term typed into browsers, painless ways. How long for smoke inhalation? He couldn't know details yet. He stared as though he'd swallowed the whole catalog of her undoing. Lantern flame flickered, threatening to die. Mia backed from the window lungs, snapping for air. She tugged the tape free and rolled the paper into a cylinder, shoving it beneath the mattress. No one must see that prophecy before dawn. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence swelled, then broke beneath the creak of porch steps. Jacob's voice floated up from below, a rough murmur aimed at the horse. Words blurred, tone half caution, half prayer. Outside, Jacob held the white bridle coiled in his left hand. He'd risen when the first thud woke him, instincts primed by years of midnight patrols in ruined streets. The pistol twitch never quite left his hip, though the weapon lay locked away. He approached Whisper slowly, placing himself between the stallion and Mia's window. Moonlight glimmered on the bleached leather dangling from his fist. He spoke softly, asking what the horse needed him to see. He remembered Mia's tremor at dinner, the way her fork scraped but never lifted food the moment her gaze lingered on the fireplace too long. She had always been quiet, but tonight her quiet felt loaded like an artillery shell left unexploded in a playground. He replayed the afternoon when Koa taught breathwork. Mia's exhale had sounded like surrender, not relief. The hoof strike now seemed less alarm and more code pay attention. Whisper pawed the ground, angling his body so an old scar caught moonlight. Jacob raised his free hand to the horse's neck. Beneath hide, he felt muscles ticking a pocket watch made of thunder. "Show me," he murmured. Whisper stepped sideways toward the water trough beneath Mia's window. There, Jacob noticed something, a crimson pastel stub ground into soil, its color too bright for night. He crouched, pinched it between calloused fingers, and smelled wax and dust. Instinct flexed. He pocketed the pastel, scanned the veranda. A length of rope lay coiled near the rail, the same rope used earlier to hoist hay. Nothing sinister, and yet. He inhaled sharply, catching an acidic edge riding the night air like burned citrus. He looked at Whisper. The stallion's ears flattened momentarily, storm warning. Upstairs, Mia paced, pulse tapping Morse inside her throat. She considered locking the door, then remembered it had no lock. She listened for Jacob's boots, but heard only the windmill and her own blood. Her laptop sat on the desk lid, closed drive stuffed with unshared photos, burn scars, news clippings, maps pinned with red circles. She opened the drawer, hiding the rest of the crimson pastels. Only two remained. Jacob entered the kitchen, poured rainwater into a tin cup. Mind knitting possibilities. Pastel hoof alarm rope, burned smell pieces on a board. He remembered Koa's phrase, "Some medicine doesn't translate into voltage." Mia's hollow eyes replayed until his palms sweated around the cup. He set it down and climbed the staircase. Each creak sounded louder in his head than in the wood. At the landing, he paused. No sound from her room, but monitor light glowed under the door. He knocked once, gentle. Silence. He knocked again. "Kiddo, you awake?" A pause. Then the click of a laptop closing. Footsteps padded. The door opened a sliver. Mia stood behind it, hair tangled, outline blurred. "Everything okay?" Jacob asked. She nodded, but her chin wobbled. His gaze fell to charcoal smears on her wrists. He drew the pastel stub from his pocket and set it on the doorframe. No words came. Downstairs, Whisper stamped again, punctuating the moment. Jacob waited, letting silence settle. He smelled adrenaline on Mia's breath. He remembered classrooms teaching soldiers to notice displaced gravel, unusual trash, the small details that warned of danger. Tonight, the pastel was his displaced stone. He pushed it toward her. After a beat, she took it, fingers, trembling nails, rimmed with black half-moons. Jacob exhaled through his nose. "If your head's loud," he whispered, "you don't have to listen alone." Mia blinked. Tears welled, but did not fall. He didn't press further. "Tomorrow we ride out past the West Ridge," he added, voice steady. "Fresh air helps drawings breathe." Mia swallowed, surprised by the invitation. Dawn was still a rumor on the eastern horizon when Dr. Hannah Park unlatched the equipment case she had hidden beneath her bunk. The ranch slept in a hush punctuated only by the groan of timbers settling and the distant rustle of wallabies in the scrub. She worked by the glow of a penlight, sliding 2 neural halo bands, a portable magnetoencephalo transducer, and a packet of adhesive contact points into a canvas messenger bag. Every clasp she fastened sounded to her like a verdict being recorded in permanent ink. And each verdict testified that today, science would either justify its confidence or drown in its own hubris. Outside, a lace of pale silver drew itself over the paddocks, stretching shadows northward like black ribbons laid out for a funeral. The barn lanterns still burned weak amber halos, revealing the corrugated roof's rust scars. Jacob stood at the gate, already leaning on the stile white bridle coiled across his broad palm. He'd sensed motion the way old soldiers do through vibrations in the floorboards before a footstep even lands. Mia shuffled 3 paces behind Hannah, hoodie zip, half-closed chin buried so deep she seemed intent on folding herself into invisibility. "Morning," Jacob offered, though the word lacked celebration. "You sure about this?" Hannah matched his gaze. "If Whisper's responses are genuine, we need baseline data. 15 minutes, then we're done." Jacob's eyes dropped to the bridle. The leather looked paler than yesterday, as though each hour leached more color. He flexed his hand, and the bit rang a single metallic chime. "15's an eternity if something breaks," he murmured. Mia caught that and swallowed. She carried a sketch pad against her ribs, pages blank except for charcoal fingerprints that bled through the cardboard back. Hannah smiled at her, a careful expression meant to reassure. It did the opposite. Mia clutched the pad tighter. They crossed the paddock to the round pen. Whisper waited inside, posture regal, but restless hooves shifting on the red dirt. Halo clouds drifted overhead, turning the sky into molten pewter. Hannah opened the gate, gesturing for Jacob to enter first, an unspoken admission of the horse's allegiance. Jacob slid the bridle cord through his belt like a talisman, then stepped forward, palm extended. Whisper's ears twitched twice, finally settling when Jacob's voice hummed the 3-note cadence he'd learned in Afghanistan to calm bomb-sniffing dogs. Hannah positioned the transducer on a folding tripod just outside the fence. The device looked like a narrow obelisk of milled aluminum crowned by dish antennas and braided lead wires. She powered it up. Indicator lights bloomed sea green along its spine. She motioned Mia inside. The girl hesitated, eyes darting to the sensor rig, then to Whisper, then to the exit that suddenly seemed very far away. Jacob offered a nod that said, "I'm here." Mia stepped across the threshold. Inside, the air felt charged as though static crawled through every particle of dust. Hannah pressed 2 adhesive biosensors to Mia's temples, whispering instructions. These only read surface potentials, nothing invasive. Try to breathe evenly. She clipped the neural halo around Mia's forehead. The band pulsed faint blue as it synced to the transducer. Numbers printed themselves across Hannah's tablet. Alpha rhythms, micro-Tesla fluctuations, heart rate variability. Everything looked ordinary, except for an aurora of noise that seemed to pulse whenever Mia's gaze touched the horse. "Walk to him slowly," Hannah directed. Mia took 1 step, then another. Whisper watched, neck arching. At 3 paces, the stallion's ears flattened sideways. A tremor rippled through his barrel. Hannah noted a surge on the readout, gamma burst amplitude off the chart. She exhaled, excitement and caution merging. Mia reached a trembling hand. The stallion inhaled so sharply it seemed to vacuum the oxygen from the pen. Then he stamped. The earth shook. Sand leapt into the air like sparks. Jacob flinched. Hannah's fingers froze over her tablet. Whisper's eyes widened, sclera flashing white. A deep bellow tore from his throat, an ancient guttural roar that sounded like tectonic plates grinding beneath ocean trenches. Mia recoiled. Her heart rate trace skyrocketed. Hannah's tablet beeped a seizure of warnings. Whisper reared. Front hooves scythed the air. The leather bridle slipped from Jacob's belt when he leapt backward, landing with a soft thud on red earth. Whisper's shadow swallowed it, the white strap stark against the ground. The stallion's hind legs dug trenches as he pivoted, crashing into the corral rails. Lumber groaned. A bolt sheared off like a gunshot. Wires ripped free from the halo. Electrodes pinged against the dirt like spent shell casings. Static discharge crackled through the air, and Hannah tasted copper on her tongue. She lunged forward to grab Mia, but the girl bolted sideways, ducking under a sagging rail. Whisper plunged after, but Jacob intercepted, throwing up both arms. The horse veered hindquarters, colliding with the sensor tripod. Aluminum buckled. Circuits exploded in a shower of blue sparks. Glass from a display shattered, peppering the sand with lethal glitter. Mia sprinted across the paddock legs, pumping breath, breaking into ragged sobs. "Stop!" Hannah shouted, but the wind stole the word. Mia vaulted a feed trough, lost balance, and tumbled into a thicket of saltbush outside the fence line. She rose, bleeding from one knee, and kept running toward the tree line, where morning fog clung like wet gauze. Whisper whirled, wild-eyed, tail lashing. Jacob grabbed the broken bridle, raised it like a flag of surrender. "Easy, boy," he rasped. But the stallion's terror had inverted into wrath, aimed at every device that dared translate suffering. He stomped the crushed transducer, splintering its carbon shell. Capacitors popped like firecrackers. Smoke coiled upward, stinging nostrils, forcing Jacob to shield his face. Hannah scrambled to disengage the last sensor cable tethered to the horse's mane. In her haste, she slipped, knees slamming dirt. Whisper swung his head. The cable snapped, whipping across her cheek. Blood welled, though she barely felt the sting. All cognition shrank to two facts. The animal was frightened beyond language, and Mia had disappeared into woods where cliffs waited. With Jacob's calming whistles finally piercing the frenzy, Whisper slowed. Each shuddering breath rattled his ribs. He sidestepped until his hoof struck the fallen bridle. The white strap clung to fetlock for a heartbeat before sliding free, landing limp and motionless in the dust. It looked suddenly fragile, like discarded prayer beads. Whisper's ears pricked toward the forest. He snorted, exhaled, then dropped his head as if listening for a heartbeat, retreating among the eucalypts. A hush reclaimed the arena, broken only by the crackle of sparking circuitry and the hiss of cables burning insulation. Hannah rose, wiping blood from her cheek, hand shaking. The tablet's screen was spiderwebbed, but functional. Charts still jittered Mia's biosignals, broadcasting fear distance, attenuating amplitude. She watched the line tremble lower, lower, then flatline into noise as the girl fled out of range. Her shoulders sagged under a weight heavier than any machine. Jacob coiled the bridle, carefully dusting ash from its once white sheen. He avoided Hannah's eyes. Smoke drifted past them, staining the dawn with chemical dusk. "Hope your 15 minutes were worth it," he said, voice ragged. Hannah opened her mouth, but shame clamped it shut. Her ambition lay scattered as silicon shards. The data captured felt obscene, wrestled from a living pulse that never consented. She looked at Whisper. He met her gaze, unblinking, verdict delivered. She knelt, picked up a shard of circuit board edges glowing hot, and let it singe her glove. Consequences tattooed themselves quickly on flesh. From the ridge came a gull's cry, startled and sharp. Jacob glanced toward the tree line where Mia had vanished. A ribbon of red sunrise unfolded above the treetops, identical in hue to the pastels the girl favored. Fire in the sky echoed fire on paper. Jacob felt his stomach drop. "She's headed toward Lone Gorge," he whispered. Whisper caught that word, gorge, and whinnied a low tremor that vibrated hope and dread. He pawed the earth nostrils, tasting the air like a compass seeking true north. Without waiting for permission, he lunged toward the broken gate, splinters flying as he forced passage. The horse galloped, bridle forgotten mane, catching dawn's first blaze, hooves hammering a manifesto into the soft ground, find the girl. Hannah watched breathless as the silhouette disappeared into the tree shadows. For the first time since choosing neuroscience over cardiology, she doubted the supremacy of numbers. Jacob tossed her a spare halter. "We go after," he said. "Leave the scrap heap." He pointed at the smoldering remains of her instrument. It already told its lie. They sprinted, Hannah lagging seconds behind. Calves, burning lungs, stitching pain across her chest. The forest swallowed them quickly. Branches clawing sleeves, dew soaking socks. Somewhere ahead, Whisper's hoofbeats faded into muffled thunder. Mia's biosensor still clung to her forehead. Hannah prayed the adhesive would fail before the cliffs loomed. Dread crept up her spine like frost. What if numbers chased her into the abyss as surely as despair did? Behind them, smoke from the crushed machine curled into the lightning sky, forming a single column that the wind tore sideways, an accidental distress flare no one would see. The white bridle lay abandoned in red sand, its surface darkened by ash, its sanctity violated. But as the first true beam of sunlight pierced the arena, the strap glinted fiercely, a silent admonition that some things are meant to carry souls, not data. The warning lay unheeded while forest shadows swallowed footfalls, and the day rolled forward without a promise of safety. The chase had only just begun, but priorities had inverted. Find the heartbeat first, parse the mystery later. Censors and publications could wait among the ruins. In their place surged an older instinct forged by kinship between hoof and heart. Ahead, a frightened girl hurtled roots toward a horizon. Behind her thundered loyalty, regret, and the promise of redemption. The sun had only just peeled a thin rind of apricot light across the Tasmanian ridgeline when the quarantine stall exploded in a thunder of splinters. A gun crack of timber tore the dawn wide open. Magpies shrieked from their wire perch and spiraled upward like startled ash. Jacob Mercer, halfway through lacing his boots, recognized the sound with the grim accuracy of a man who once counted roadside bombs by ear. He bolted from the bunkhouse and arrived in time to see Whisper, the great chestnut whose heartbeat ruled the ranch, burst clean through the fractured doorway, shards of cedar pinwheeling off his shoulders. Between the stallion's teeth hung the bleached bridle reins, streaming behind him like a comet tail. The metal bit rang against enamel, a hollow bell that tolled for the missing girl everyone was already afraid to name. Whisper landed, gathered and vaulted the outer fence in a single soaring blur. Boards clapped back like applause, then folded defeated. Sunlight caught the bridle mid-arc, flaring white so violently it seemed to carve a Morse flare into the haze follow. Now, believe. Without a moment's pause, the horse drove straight into the eucalyptus shadows that Mia Quinn had sketched in charcoal only hours earlier, the very corridor of trunks she'd rendered as a throat leading to red glowing oblivion. Jacob managed one running step before instinct told him he would never close the gap on foot. He spun instead toward the main house, where chaos had already begun uncoiling. Koa Talbot vaulted the porch rail, eyes flashing alarm. Harper and Sala stumbled onto the gravel barefoot, still half-draped in dreams. Dr. Hannah Park pushed through the screen door behind them, hair unpinned, field notebook shredded at the edges. She looked not at the busted stall, but at the gap in the fence, as though trying to read numbers in the dust that might cancel what she'd done. Jacob closed the distance between them. He did not raise his voice. The menace in his murmured octave made shouting unnecessary. "You wired her like equipment," he said, voice scraping like shovel on slate. Now she's gone, and the only guardian she trusts just vanished with a rope in his mouth. Hannah tried to reply, but the apology crumpled before it reached daylight. Over her shoulder, sunlight illuminated overlapping prints, Mia's small soles pressed into red clay, half overridden by the stallion's deeper crescents. All the forensic lectures about stride length and departure angles fizzed through her brain, but none of them mattered beside that visual duet. Koa knelt at the farthest hoof crater. A single braid of Whisper's mane lay pinned there, still quivering. He lifted it, closed his eyes, and seemed to feel the echo of thunder in its fibers. "He's on the dream line," he whispered. Exact path she drew. He'll keep her between him and the sun. Jacob's jaw set like cured leather. Mia's midnight sketch with its ember-red throat wasn't invention. It was prophecy. The girl had mapped her own vanishing. Mrs. Tilley, the retired nurse who ran the kitchen, appeared on the veranda, clutching her housecoat. One look at the ruined stall and the gutted sensor rig still ticking sparks, and she gasped, "Sweet Jesus, what have you all done?" No one answered. Guilt had its own fluency. Jacob snapped commands, ropes, medkits, torches. Sala hobbled for gear. Harper filled flasks with sugared tea. Koa fetched his eucalyptus staff. Hannah stood frozen, cheeks stinging from yesterday's cable lash, the bridle's absence burning into her retinas like an afterimage of lightning. When Jacob returned with a coil of orange climbing rope, he tossed a compact thermal scope to Hannah. "You're on this search," he said, "but you don't lead it." She accepted the demotion with a silent nod. Moments later, the ATV snarled awake. Koa perched on the roll bar, scanning treetops for the hush that follows panic. Harper wedged herself beside Hannah, clutching blankets. Sala kick-started a dirt bike, its engine growling like a tethered mastiff. Gravel sprayed as they tore after the gouged track Whisper had hammered across the paddock. If a Steadicam could have followed the stallion, the shot would skim inches above loam ferns, whipping past as green comets. The white bridle would strobe through the frame reins, sketching bright glyphs in the gloom. Every hoofbeat cracked like a judge's gavel. Pain lanced the corners of Whisper's mouth, where leather bit flesh, but he carried it willingly. A message must sometimes bleed to stay truthful. He veered left at a bone-pale she-oak, exactly the contour Mia had inked. Ahead, the ground pitched to granite scree, bordered by grass trees, the flaming throat of her drawing now rendered in stone and dew. Miles behind the convoy hit washboard ridges. Hana's teeth clacked. The thermal scope danced uselessly in her hands. Mia's biosensor had gone dark 3 minutes after leaving the paddock, and the data silence felt like phantom limb pain. They crested a saddle and braked beside a burn scar. Last year's wildfire had left charcoal fingerprints here. Koa jumped down, palmed the earth, and nodded. He slowed, waiting for her to answer. Hana pulled her cracked tablet. The last GPS burst painted a red dot uncomfortably close to Lone Gorge. Jacob studied it face ashen, then punched the throttle again. Far ahead, Mia's legs finally buckled at the edge of the burn scar's skeletal trees. She collapsed beside a log, still smelling faintly of old smoke. Whisper emerged, nostrils blasting steam. He lowered the bridle into her lap and stepped back. The strap settled across her knees, glittering in stray sunshafts like the spine of some pale serpent. She traced its weathered leather, discovering nicks she hadn't noticed, tiny scars that looked like tally marks. Instinct told her each represented a life the stallion had steadied on the ledge. Back on the track, the ATV suddenly shuddered to silence. Jacob had cut the engine. A hush rolled over the forest, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire ecosystem. Through that hush came Whisper's low tremor, a sound balanced perfectly between invitation and warning. Koa held up a hand. Stop. Listen, breathe. He's talking her down, he breathed. They dismounted. Hana felt the trauma kit biting her shoulder, while guilt bit harder under her ribs. Jacob caught her sleeve. We rush. She jumps, he hissed. Hana nodded, heart pounding, as though it wanted to lead the way on its own. They advanced on foot, half-length steps, each crackling twig a potential trigger. Koa whispered a soft whistle that curved through the trunks like smoke, a Palawa lullaby meant for anxious foals. Birds quieted. Even the wind paused. From the edge of a clearing, Hana spotted the bridle gleaming like polished bone across Mia's knees. Whisper stood between girl and gorge, massive chest rising and falling in steady cadence. The stallion's ears flicked toward the newcomers, but he did not charge. He simply planted himself wider, a living barricade. Jacob raised both palms in surrender. Hana felt tears sting behind her eyes, not for fear of failure, but for the clarity of the tableau. A horse, a girl, a strip of white leather, and every error she'd made laid bare in morning light. Our story pauses here, breath held at the cliff of consequence. The bridle gleams as guidance instead of restraint, a north star hammered from sorrow and salt. Whisper waits. Mia's hand clenched around a single rein. Jacob steadies the prayer in his lungs. Koa anchors courage into the soil. Harper clutches blankets like wings. Sala readies splints he hopes will stay unused, and Hana finally understands that some signals refuse to live inside a graph. Above them, amid the hush, the day holds still long enough for one frightened heartbeat to choose direction, and every soul, human and horse alike, waits for that decision to chart the next minute of light. Morning burnt off the last scraps of fog as the search party regrouped beside the gutted sensor rig, lungs raw from the sprint and eyes stung by ash and shame. Whisper's hoofprints arrowed into the forest. But Jacob held the order to pause. They needed another compass, one calibrated not in kilohertz, but in faith. That compass arrived in the back seat of Harper's mud-flecked Land Cruiser, a lean volunteer named Elise Thornton, whose own pulse still bore the scorch marks of a suicide attempt 14 months earlier. She slid from the vehicle with the hesitance of someone stepping onto ice she expects to crack. Koa recognized the tremor in her shoulders and offered a brief nod. Survivors spot each other the way migratory birds sense a shared compass. He pressed Whisper's white bridle into her hands, leather still warm from the stallion's fury. He dropped it at the cliff, Jacob said. Maybe he meant you to carry it. Elise traced a thumb over the cracked surface, feeling old salt, old grief, old rescues trapped between fibers. She wrapped it twice around her wrist until the metal bit rested against her pulse like a silent metronome. Hana watched, mind torn between awe and professional suspicion. In her world, tools were calibrated, not trusted for their mysticism. Yet something about Elise's calm unsettled her algorithms. Harper handed Elise a canteen. Sala offered a protein bar he forgot to eat during deployment. Elise accepted both, then closed her eyes, and inhaled. She listened, not for sound, but for vibration. First came the obvious symphony cicadas, grinding heat from sap, distant magpies, rehearsing orchestra calls, wind-rattling ironbark leaves. Gradually, she dipped beneath them, seeking the subterranean base that had guided her out of her own night last year, a low tremor she later identified as Whisper's breath. It arrived again faint but certain, beating through the soles of her boots, in a 4-count rhythm, then veering west. "Mia's north of us, but moving west," Elise murmured. Koa accepted the verdict without question. He lifted his eucalyptus staff and pointed toward a corridor of wattles drenched in golden bloom. Wild daisies huada kui peppered the understory, each coin-bright head turned east like tiny suns. Harper remembered Mia tucking one behind her ear 2 dinners ago, a bright rebellion against the charcoal on her fingers. Breadcrumbs, Harper thought, left by a girl who half wanted rescue. The group reformed. Koa took point staff, tapping stones to translate terrain. Elise walked next wrist, adorned with the white leather talisman. Jacob followed, ready to intercept despair. Hana slung her disabled thermal scope, but kept her tablet pocketed, humbled for now. Harper and Sala closed the line, gathering stray petals and scanning branches for signs of torn fabric. The forest tightened quickly, trunks black with old fire scars, canopies stitching the sky into narrow ribbons of blue. Sunlight speared occasional clearings, illuminating plumes of dust kicked up by their boots. Each shaft exposed new daisies and the intermittent crescent prints of a barefoot girl. Elise maintained pace by feel. When the bridle cooled, she slowed. When it warmed, she quickened. Hana watched, half expecting confirmation bias, yet the evidence mounted with every correct turn. After half an hour, the trail spilled into a shallow creek. Mud held 2 kinds of impressions, the deep half-moons of Whisper's hooves and the light ovals of human feet. Daisy petals floated like extinguished sparks on the water. Elise knelt, dipped her palm, and let current tighten the leather about her wrist. The bit glinted underwater and angled left. "Upstream switchback ridge," she said. Jacob glanced at Koa. The tracker confirmed with a nod, spotting fresh bark scrapes where a large body had brushed a trunk. The climb taxed everyone. Granite slabs jutted at ankle-breaking angles, forcing Sala to hand his cane to Harper and crawl. Hana's calves burned, but she refused to slow. Guilt made a brutal coach. Still they persisted, propelled by the tiny certainty that each step delayed regret. 2 terraces up the land plateaued into a clearing scarred by last summer's wildfire. Blackened trunks stood like cathedral pillars, their charcoal flaking to reveal pale cambium attempting rebirth. In the center of that living bruise, Mia sat with her knees hugged tight and her face hidden by tangled hair. Whisper stood behind her, a bronze wall glistening with sweat. Jacob signaled a halt. Even a Whisper felt vulgar. Elise advanced alone. Whisper's ears twitched, recognizing the piece of himself. He snorted once, stepped aside, and repositioned to face downslope, blocking any premature retreat toward the gorge. Permission granted. Elise approached Mia, and without a word folded into a seated mirror image. She set the bridle on the ash-dusted rock between them, and plucked a single daisy, spinning it like a coin when nerves exceed vocabulary. Minutes coiled around them, silent, stretching long enough for hearts to decelerate. Cicadas resumed, but more distant. Finally, Elise spoke, voice pitched precisely to avoid startling. "The first time I met Whisper, I was planning to leave too." She let the admission hang like laundry in still air. Mia didn't move. "He didn't fix me," Elise continued. "He just listened so loudly that I could hear the part of me that still hoped." She rolled her sleeve, exposing faint scars. That part can be very quiet, but it never lies. A gust stirred ash into miniature cyclones. Elise pointed at the daisies carpeting the burn. "These flowers only sprout after heat so intense it cracks seed coats sealed for years. Fire feels like death, but it's also an invitation." She nudged the bridle. "Same with this. Leather once restrained, now guides. You choose how." Mia's shoulders trembled. Sob or shiver, Elise couldn't tell. She waited. Whisper lowered his head until his nostrils brushed Mia's crown, exhaling a hot sigh that ruffled hair and dust. Mia's hand rose fingertip, grazing the white leather. Her thumb traced a vein of cracked beeswax. Tears slipped free, pattering onto the bridle, darkening it by shades. Back on the perimeter, Hana's knees buckled in relief she didn't deserve. Jacob turned away to survey horizon, hiding tears crafted from equal parts joy and fear. Sala pressed 2 fingertips to a carotid pulse. Only he could feel confirmation that life still flowed. Harper clutched her blanket tighter, imagining how warmth might feel to a heart thawing. Elise let Mia cry until the soil beneath them dampened. Then she rose slowly, joints creaking. She did not offer a hand. She simply remained standing, a lighthouse, if Mia wished to navigate by it. The girl finally mirrored the move, swaying once, but steadying. Elise looped the bridle over Mia's wrist and tightened it gently. Not a shackle, she whispered in orientation. Whisper stepped forward, placing his massive shoulder against Mia's back, encouraging forward momentum. Together they walked toward Jacob's waiting arms, but he refrained from closing the distance. Instead, he pivoted, forming a protective flank. Harper laid the blanket across Mia's shoulders, and Salah handed her a flask of water laced with honey salt to coax electrolytes back. The girl drank greedily, then allowed Elise to wipe mud from her cheek with a sleeve. Hannah approached last heart-banging apology against ribs. She offered no files, no metrics, only a soft, "I'm sorry." Mia nodded. It sounded like forgiveness, but could have been simple acknowledgement. Either way, Hannah would earn trust in increments measured by presence, not words. The party turned downhill. Elise kept pace beside Mia. Occasionally, their wrists bumped leather against denim, a metronome of survival. When terrain steepened, Whisper positioned behind Rump, acting as brake, preventing slides. Koa hummed a prayer in Palawakani cadence, matching footsteps. The forest listened sheathed in noonshade and decided not to rain. They reached the creek, and Elise guided Mia across slippery stones, each step sealing a promise to return. Daisy petals still floated. Mia plucked one and tucked it behind Elise's ear. A tiny grin first crack in stone. Harper exhaled what felt like 3 days of held breath. On the far bank, Hannah paused. She looked back at the ridge where the stallion had first blocked the abyss. Distant smoke from the broken sensor rig curled into a blue thread, fading. She turned off her tablet completely. Some data had to be recorded in the brain's scar tissue, not silicon. An hour later, the paddock fence came into view. Splintered gate still yawning. Whisper escorted Mia through, then halted. Elise removed the bridle from Mia's wrist and returned it to the stallion's mouth. He accepted, tossing head once reins, flaring like banner of victory. Jacob guided Mia to a bench beneath blooming bottlebrush, and Harper wrapped her in the blanket. Elise remained by the fence watching horse and girl. She felt the pulse in her wrist, surprised to find it steady. 2 years ago, it beat like a malfunctioning metronome, desperate to stop. Now it felt like percussion in a score still unfolding. She whispered thanks to the horse, to the flowers, to the wildfire that cracked 1,000 seed coats so new color could invade charcoal. When the ranch bell rang for midday meal, the group filed toward the cookhouse. Mia walked unaided, blanket trailing like a cape. Elise lingered a moment longer, pressing her palm flat against a fence post. The grain felt warm, out of all those xylem rivers, pushing upward, because they knew no other direction. She added her heartbeat to their current, then turned and followed the other's bridle-shaped imprint still tingling around her wrist. In the distance, a breeze lifted daisy petals into the sky, swirling them into a spiral that mimicked the endless curve of survival, rising, falling, catching light, briefly becoming a constellation before scattering to fertilize unseen soil. Some journeys end that way, not with a cure but with a compass, a chorus of footsteps, and the humble faith that listening without agenda can redirect a person toward daylight they had forgotten still existed. Dawn's afterglow surrenders to cobalt gloom as the searchline crests the final rise, where scrub folds into a basalt ravine clouded with fern and spray. The roar of falling water swells, beating like a vast arterial drum hidden behind stone. Jacob sees the mist first, then the silver knife of the cascade slashing through moss-slick rock 60 feet above the plunge pool. Her hoodie is soaked black, clinging to ribs that climb and fall with infuriating slowness. The stallion himself kneels, forelegs folded, muzzle hovering just above her sternum. Water dust pearls across his coat. Every breath he releases curls into vapor like incense swirling from a broken censer. Jacob's boots skid on pebbles as he descends. Each step ignites the minefield wired inside his nervous system. Mortar's remembered friends bled out orders shouted through static. None of those memories buckle him. The sight of one limp teenage hand does. His lungs cave. He drops beside Mia, and Whisper knees, smashing stone tears detonating without warning. They pour hot and ungoverned spattering dust into mud. The last time he cried was Kandahar zippering a body bag. This valley grief feels like permission finally granted. Whisper regards him with the solemnity of an ancient magistrate. His eyes brim with midnight, yet light skates their surface like dawn skating old glass. He lowers his head farther until the white blaze on his forehead touches Jacob's shoulder, a benediction or a transfer of duty. Jacob's fingers tremble against Mia's throat, searching for pulse. It flutters weak but steady. He presses his brow to the sodden fabric over her heart, letting the waterfall's thunder fill his skull, letting her faint rhythm align to its massive cadence. A broken metronome learning a grander beat. The others arrive in staggered breaths, Elise clutching medical kit, Koa brandishing tourniquet, Harper carrying blankets, Hannah powerless but present. Yet no one dares close the last few feet. The tableau feels consecrated, framed by curtains of spray and lit by heaven's own aperture. Elise finally sets the kit down and kneels opposite Jacob. She studies Mia's wrist, its skin chafed raw where the white leather cuts. With surgical calm, she slides a finger beneath the strap. Her voice barely outshouts, "Water, Jacob. We need to loosen this." Her hands going numb, but Jacob's hands refuse directives. Sob still erasing his motor control. Whisper lifts his head and with shocking gentleness nibbles the knot. Leather slackens. Blood floods back to fingers. Elise exhales gratitude. She checks pupil response, breathing rate, scalp for impact. A superficial cut at the temple seeps vermilion diluted by spray. Hannah hands over gauze without words, her professional training finally subservient to Elise's steadier touch. Koa stands sentinel, scanning treeline for threats human or animal or memory. He begins a low chant in Palawakani syllables, ticking like stones knocked together in riverbeds. The sound reverberates through basalt, mingling with plunge and pulse-weaving rope ladders between this ledge and some unseen plateau of meaning. Harper drapes a blanket across Mia's legs, its tartan stripes turning darker as fibers drink mist. Jacob's tears subside to hiccuped breaths. He lifts his head and meets Whisper's gaze. "Thank you," he croaks, voice shredded. The stallion answers not with neigh or snort, but with a single nod, a deliberate gravity-laden dip of the pole that seems to ripple through air as slow thunder ripples lake water. The gesture shatters Hannah more than Data ever could. She understands now that nods can carry payloads beyond any terabyte can smuggle whole philosophies of survival. Elise finishes bandaging and signals thumbs up. Mia's eyelids twitch, eyelashes beaded with droplets. Her lips part, a thin rasp escapes, half whisper, half cough. Jacob grips her hand, mindful of bruised wrist. "You're safe, kiddo," he says, surprising himself with the softness of his own certainty. Mia's eyes slit open. First they see stone ceiling of cloud, then the braided leather around her limb, then the horse towering like a myth. Panic flits across her gaze. Jacob squeezes. "He kept you with us," he tells her. "We all kept you." Her focus drifts to Jacob's wet cheeks. Shock registers adults are not supposed to cry. Something inside her clicks, a latch lifting. Tears surge from her, mingling with waterfall spray until sorrow and river are indistinguishable. She tries to speak, but only a keening whine emerges. Whisper's ears swivel, catching the frequency of a heart uncaging itself. He breathes rhythm into her wail, and soon the wail modulates, falling into cadence with the roaring water, an ancient lullaby disguised as thunder. Hannah edges closer. She wants to record this sound not for journals, but to remember what resurrection feels like. Instead, she folds to her knees and bows her head. Confession without him. The tablet in her bag stays silent. She no longer needs it to measure miracles. Koa ends his chant and touches 2 fingers to his forehead, then to Whisper's brow. They share silence dense enough to bend light. Elise opens Mia's unbound hand and slips a daisy into her palm petals, ragged from climb but still yellow brave. Mia closes fingers slowly, as though gripping dawn itself. Jacob lifts his gaze at Elise. Their eyes meet, soldier and survivor, both acquainted with edges. He mouths a word live, and she nods, tears catching in the hollows beneath her cheekbones. Time hiccups. The waterfall's roar swells, then recedes like lungs exhaling prayer. Sun edges past a bank of cloud, projecting a fragmentary rainbow across the spray. Its arc lands precisely on Whisper's withers, painting him in temporary armor. Gasps ripple through the group. Even Hannah allows superstition one breath. Mia sees it too. Her lips twitch around the ghost of a smile, the first since arrival at this haunted paradise. She raises the hand without bridle, reaching toward color. Jacob supports her elbow. Her fingers slice through prism light, fracturing rainbow into glitter that kisses her bruises. She gasps, astonished by beauty still willing to touch her. Whisper stands and steps back, letting Jacob and Elise lift Mia carefully. Legs wobble but hold. The stallion observes nostrils flaring, ensuring gravity obeys. Harper offers another blanket gentler than wind. Sala arrives last, stowing his radio that never found signal and organizes stretcher protocol. Though no one truly wants rigid frames now, they opt instead for slow walk, leaning on each other. Before leaving, Jacob retrieves the bridle. Its leather feels heavier, waterlogged with tears spray blood. He drapes it over Whisper's neck. "Yours," he murmurs. Whisper flicks an ear, shakes once, then stills. They begin descent. Koa leads mapping safer switchbacks. Elise and Jacob flank Mia, each step measured to her shaky cadence. Whisper follows last, his hulking form blocking backslide. Mist cools fevered cheeks, eucalyptus aroma fans nerves. Each heartbeat finds new reason, each footfall nails despair deeper into past tense. Halfway down, a thunderclap echoes just water finishing its relentless argument with gravity. But hearts jolt as if God applauded. Mia grips the daisy. Petals shred in her sweat seeds, scattering onto path small promises of future yellow. She feels the imprint of leather still denting her wrist and knows that scar will remain map and memorial. Reaching valley floor, they pause near a calm pool where Waterfall exhaust rests. Whisper steps forward, drinks, then lifts head. Droplets beat his muzzle mirror images of earlier tears. He turns to Mia and offers her the pool's reflection. She kneels, cupping water to her lips. It tastes of stone and sky and second chance. Jacob studies the ripples, sees his crying face distorted into something younger. War feels distant, replaced by this smaller, more immediate battle one he can finally win. He thinks of letters he never wrote to comrades' families and vows to write tonight. Hana kneels too, not to drink, but to dip fingers, trail water across eyelids, washing away the residual itch of hubris. She opens her bag, extracts tablet, powers it up, only to delete every unconsented recording. Data tracks vanish like footprints in surf. She exhales lighter. Koa breaks a branch of wattle and lays it at Mia's feet. "For courage," he says. Elise pulls a coil of gauze and loops it loosely over bridle mark, not to hide, but to soothe. Harper begins humming an old lullaby. Sala joins with low harmony. Voices blend with water until melody seems to rise from rocks. Whisper finally moves. He approaches Jacob, nudges chest. Jacob strokes the powerful neck, then steps back. The stallion lowers himself, front knees, then hind settling beside pool. He bows head once more, slower than before, a seismic nod that reverberates through marrow. Everyone feels it. This is the final approval, the sealing wax on a fragile contract between living and lived. Mia watches, tears quiet now. She reaches to touch the white blaze on Whisper's face. He accepts, eyelids lowering. In that quiet moment, water hushes birds, hush hearts, hush the universe, leaning in to witness hinge turn. And somewhere behind that hush, a drum resumes. Boom, hush, boom, hush. The rhythm of a heart newly convinced it belongs to tomorrow. They rise together. Rainbow fades as sun climbs, but color lingers inside retinas, inside blood. The trek back will be slow, but slow suits healing. Whisper returns to his feet, shakes water from mane. Droplets scatter, catching light like miniature stars, and some part of Mia believes each droplet marks a day she has yet to fill. Jacob shoulders his pack, offers Mia the first step of path. She nods, a small, brave echo of the horse's grand gesture. They move out, leaving pool to reflect empty sky, leaving Waterfall to continue sermon. Whisper takes rearguard, tail flicking rhythm. Distant thunder rolls, perhaps thunder, perhaps heartbeat of land, acknowledging pact. The ledge grows small behind them, but its charge endures. Keep breathing, keep listening, hold fast the tether, until the heart remembers why it beats. Whisper has done his part. The rest belongs to those still walking. The infirmary cabin breathed with the slow rhythm of dawn, pine walls, glowing amber as sun leaked through warped window panes. A sheet of gauze fluttered on the breeze from a cracked pane, the loose corner tapping a wooden bed frame in tick-tock tempo. On the mattress, Mia Quinn's stirred lashes quivering across skin bruised the color of early blueberries. Outside, kookaburras rehearsed their raucous hymn, but inside, everything whispered the rustle of blanket fibers. The pulse inside her ears, the hush of two adults who had kept vigil all night and feared to break the spell of survival by speaking first. Jacob Mercer sat on a milking stool at Mia's bedside, elbows on knees, fingers knitted so tightly, his knuckles resembled river-washed stones. The buttons on his work shirt were uneven. He'd dressed blind, unwilling to step away, even long enough to find a mirror. Every time Mia's lips parted in a dream murmur, He held his breath, measuring the rise of her chest against the clock in his head that once timed artillery shells. Nothing in Afghanistan had coaxed tears. Now moisture brimmed again, unashamed and uncontrolled. He exhaled when her eyelids finally fluttered open. Mia's first sight was the ceiling, a patchwork of ancient beams, stained dark by decades of candle smoke. Light shifted across them like liquid gold, refracting through the bottle of saline that hung above her. Then she looked sideways into Jacob's eyes. What she saw there was not the stern rancher of her memory, but a man raw as an exposed nerve, gratitude embossed on every line of his weathered face. Her own pulse ticked faster, not in panic, but in recognition someone else was shouldering the weight she thought only she carried. A corner of her mouth lifted, almost imperceptible. But Jacob saw the arc and answered with a smile that split him open. At the door, Dr. Hannah Park hovered, clutching the neural halo rig she'd salvaged from the wreckage yesterday. The headband's diodes still glowed faintly, as if refusing to admit obsolescence. Hannah's hair was unpinned, falling in inky strands around cheekbones streaked with dried waterfall spray. She had rehearsed an apology through the sleepless hours, one part academic confession, one part human plea. Yet seeing Mia, conscious respiration steady, made every prepared sentence feel like a data table beside a sunrise. She stepped forward and rested the halo on the bedside table, placing it almost tenderly, like setting down ashes that needed final rites. Mia noticed the device and tensed pupils contracting. Hannah caught the reaction and raised both palms. "You don't owe me a single second inside that," she said, voice hoarse. "I came to do something pure. I almost did the opposite." She unspooled a length of electrode cable, coiled it neatly, then looped the coil around a wrist like a bracelet of contrition. "When you're stronger, maybe we'll decide together what tools belong here. For now, it's just us breathing." Jacob watched, gauging sincerity with a soldier's radar for threat. He saw no guile, only repentance. Mia licked dry lips. Words felt foreign, but silence felt heavier. "I dreamed of the falls," she whispered, voice like paper torn along a fold. Water turned to starlight midair. Hannah's eyes stung. That image could fuel 1,000 published abstracts. Yet she understood her role was to witness, not to mine. She nodded. "Starlight is accurate," she replied. "Everyone saw it, but only you carried it into sleep." Outside, a kookaburra's cackle dissolved into magpie warbles. Jacob rose. "Let's give her fresh air," he said. He wrapped a blanket around Mia's shoulders and guided her toward the doorway. Hannah slung the halo rig by its cable, following. The morning smelled of wet eucalyptus and smoldering campfire embers. Whisper grazed in the paddock tail, swishing coat iridescent where dew refracted sun. When he lifted his head and saw Mia, his nostrils flared in recognition. He ambled to the fence and waited motionless, but for the twitch of one ear, an invitation written in patience. Mia's steps slowed at the gate. Her heart tossed inside its cage, not with dread, but with awe. Whisper's breath fogged the timber rail between them, leaving dark halos that evaporated after each exhale. Mia reached over and brushed her fingers across his blaze. The stallion closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. Jacob felt the earth recalibrate its spin. 100 yards beyond the river that fed the waterfall curled through reeds. Hannah's gaze drifted to it, then to the halo rig in her hand. She exhaled, felt its weight, accusation, and possibility both. Without alerting the others, she walked toward the riverbank. At the cliff's edge, the water dropped 30 feet into a churn of white foam before flowing on. Hannah wrapped the cable around the headband one final time, kissed the cold metal, and tossed the entire apparatus into the torrent. It arced, flashed, and vanished, swallowed by roar and mist. The act made no theatrical splash. But Hannah felt something tear free in her chest, some tether to life lived through measurement alone. She wiped her cheeks, not sure whether the moisture was mist or tears, and retraced her steps lighter by 12 pounds in one long-held delusion. When she returned, Jacob stood in the paddock gate, holding it open. He wasn't looking at her. He was studying the horizon, where dusty road met sky. A pickup from town rattled into view, followed by an aging station wagon and a hatchback belching blue smoke. In the beds and back seats of those vehicles sat strangers clutching thermoses, duffel bags, and the glassy stare of people who'd spent nights bargaining with shadows. Word had already traveled about the horse that heard despair about the girl, saved from a cliff by breath and by nod. Jacob's decision crystallized in real time. The ranch gates would never close again. No chart of projected expenses, no insurance forms, just open doors and a gamble that kindness multiplies provisions. He strode to the main gatehouse, where a plywood sign once advertised equine therapy, sliding scale. He yanked the sign down and flipped it. With charcoal scavenged from fire pit embers, he scrawled, "New words, sanctuary. Come sit. No questions, no cost." He planted the sign where sun ignited its letters, then stepped aside. The first carload disembarked tentative as refugees, an elderly woman clutching a folded flag. A boy, no older than 10, with scars webs on his wrists, a middle-aged man gripping sobriety chips like talismans. Whisper lifted his head, higher ears quivering as if reading the frequencies each carried. Mia watched from the fence pulse quickening, not in fear, but anticipation. She knew these people. She did not know their names or stories, but she identified the shape of their silence, the curvature of shoulders hunched beneath invisible weight. Whisper ambled from her side into the open, positioning himself where sunlight gilded his mane. One by one, the newcomers approached. No instructions were given. They simply sat in the grass, within a circle his presence created, exactly as Mia once had, before tears tore loose and turned her path. Elise Thornton emerged from the bunkhouse with a basket of loaves she'd baked through the pre-dawn hours, kneading dough to keep restlessness at bay. She handed slices to visitors, not as snack, but as ritual proof that bodies deserve warmth and yeast and salt, even when minds doubt worth. Koa Talbot set his eucalyptus staff into the ground and began whittling wood chips into spirals, each shaving catching light before falling like petals. He hummed the Dreamtime melody, inviting air itself into participation. Hannah lingered at the fence, hesitant. Data collection had always granted her role clarity. Now she was spectator to an equation solved without her variables. She felt useless until Harper drifted over, carrying a tin pot of Billy tea. "Could use an extra pair of hands," Harper said, no accusation in her tone. Hannah took the pot and cups, distributing them to the seated strangers. Each thank you felt like a stitch sewing her back into the scene. Mia remained near the rail, hands still tingling from Whisper's muzzle. She sensed a flutter inside, tentative aliveness, distinct from adrenaline or fear. It begged expression. She slipped away to the work shed where canvases leaned dusty against beams. She selected a blank 8x5 board and a fistful of pastels, sunflower yellow river blue, and a white that dazzled like noon. She carried them to a stump within view of the ad hoc circle and began to draw first tentative arcs, then assertive bands of light that cut across imagined sky. People in the grass noticed. Nobody interrupted. The act of drawing felt like breathing through a new set of lungs. Jacob walked the perimeter, eyes scanning for needs before they shouted. At intervals, he paused, overwhelmed by the sight, combat veterans leaning against disabled grandmothers, teenagers clasping strangers' hands. Whisper standing sentinel, yet never domineering kids braiding daisies into his tail while he flicked flies with regal indifference. The horse's silence was louder than any pep talk Jacob had recited to recruits. It said, "Exist, I will witness your weight and declare it bearable." By noon, the meadow looked festival bright blankets, spread canteens lined up like pewter soldiers. Sketches blooming on scrap paper, tears mingling with laughter that sounded rusty yet sincere. Hannah gathered the leftover sensors she hadn't sacrificed and carried them to the tool shed. She removed batteries, stripped wires, repurposed headbands into impromptu splints and plant holders. Nothing electronic remained, but a single LED she kept on her keychain reminder that light unshared is light wasted. At the communal table near the kitchen, Mrs. Tilly ladled kangaroo stew into tin bowls. She squinted at Hannah, recognized a woman in need of simple orders, and barked, "Bread basket's empty, Doc, fill it." Hannah obeyed with gratitude, discovering that service required less calibration than research. She carried refilled baskets into the sun. One by one, she knelt to level eye contact with each visitor, offering bread, offering presents, nothing measured. Mid-afternoon clouds, massed shadows draping the pasture. Whisper pivoted so the white bridle mark on his neck caught residual glow. He looked carved from stormlight. Mia set down her pastel, signaled Jacob. Together, they approached the horse. Mia uncoiled the dappled strap still slung around Whisper's shoulders. She lifted it to Jacob. He hesitated. This talisman once symbolized control, then caution, then salvation. Mia smiled, eyes vibrant. "Maybe it's just a reminder now," she said. She draped it instead over a fence post at the pasture's edge, letting wind animate it like a small white flag. Visitors noticed, followed suit with their own tokens, sobriety coins, letters, never mailed hospital bracelets. Soon the post gleamed with a mosaic of relinquished burdens. The breeze stiffened, flipping the bridle in a slow oscillation. Hannah watched aware she witnessed raw data of a new kind, metrics of relinquishment, measurable only in the softening of shoulders. She retrieved her notebook, turned to a blank page. But instead of numbers, she wrote a single sentence. Presence is the unit of care. She tore the page free, folded it, and slid it into Mia's sketchbook when the girl wasn't looking. Dusk bled copper across the horizon. Lanterns were lit around the paddock, their glow echoing constellations soon to emerge overhead. Jacob struck a match, lit a bonfire at the meadow's center. Sparks whirled skyward, imitating galaxies Mia had drawn on her hoodie. Elise set a billy on the flames. Koa began drumming a hollow log heartbeat tempo. Harper's voice rose in a humming braid around the rhythm. Whisper stepped closer to the fire line, ears flicking at each new harmony. He lowered his head, eyes half-lidded, accepting warmth and echoing the drum with soft stomps. For a second, the entire ranch breathed as one organism, fire crackle for lungs, drum for pulse, horses for ribs, expanding valley to valley. Mia, wrapped in a tartan, sat beside Jacob. She pointed at the bonfire sparks. "They look like starlight," she whispered, echoing her earlier dream. Jacob twined his fingers with hers, marveling at new steadiness in her grip. Hannah joined them, kneeling on the other side. She didn't speak, just placed a mug of tea in Mia's free hand. Their triangle felt complete sorrow witness and mending, all leaning inward like stones of a cairn. In the gathering dark, a teenager approached, whispered cheeks tracked with tears. He didn't reach out. He simply collapsed cross-legged before the horse, shoulders shaking. Whisper lowered his head until his muzzle hovered above the boy's spine. No words, no advice, just gravity passing from one body to another. 2 seats away, an old woman unclasped the folded flag against her chest, lay it on the ground, and let the night air touch it for the first time since her son's funeral. Elise knelt beside her head, bowed and stroked the cloth. Whisper's ear twitched. He shifted weight, acknowledging grief's new shape. By full dark, the bonfire settled into ruby coals. Lanterns cast halos around each cluster of storytellers. Yet words remained sparse, necessity surrendered to listening. Whisper walked the perimeter, checking each group his presence like a shepherd of silence. Where laughter spilled, he paused, ears forward. Where sobs clenched throats, he breathed deeper, sharing oxygen. He circled back to Mia last. Standing in the gloom, haloed by lantern light, he offered one final nod, the same slow dip he had given Jacob at the waterfall. Mia answered with her own nod, smaller but no less sincere. A contract, renewed life chooses life, even when night suggests otherwise. When stars tattooed the sky. Jacob rang the ranch bell, not as curfew, but as invitation to rest. Cots had been set up in barns, blankets thick as promises. Visitors drifted toward them, firelight painting hope across weary faces. Hannah doused lanterns, leaving only starlight and the glow of cooling coals. Whisper remained in the pasture, head raised, ears rotating to track final footfalls. Eventually, even he lay down, front legs, folding body settling like a continent into the grass. Inside the infirmary cabin, Mia could not sleep. She rose, tiptoed outside, and sat beside the fence post, festooned with tokens. She ran fingertips across each metal, paper, plastic, feeling the temperature of burdens no longer hoarded. She added her charcoal stick, the one stained with ember red, snapping it in half before dropping it at the base like seed. Behind her, the wind sighed through gum leaves. Whisper, half dozing, lifted his head and gave a low, hummed nicker, soft as lullaby. Mia closed her eyes and let the sound carry her into future minutes, unburdened by countdown. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the waterfall's roar darkened into gentle hush. A mother's shush to an infant world, learning to breathe evenly. Hannah stood at her cabin window, witnessing bridal threads dancing in moonlight. Jacob patrolled perimeter one last time, inhale matching exhale without stutter, a hymn he hadn't sung since before war. Koa lay under stars, naming constellations in language as old as basalt. Elise dreamed not of endings, but of corridors lined with daisies that sprouted after fire-lighting paths people hadn't yet believed were walkable. And Whisper slept at last. Quiet heart fueled by the simple calculus that had guided him all along. Listen. Stand, bear witness. Mathematics of unspoken salvation, absolute as gravity, silent as dawn, before birds remember to sing. Morning arrives like a soft drum roll on distant skin, coaxing the valley to wake for its first white bridal festival. Overnight lanterns along the paddock fence have cooled into opaque moons, and dew beads every waiting ribbon, ready to carry a pilgrim's most fragile sentence. The reason breath was chosen over oblivion. Jacob is first to rise. He scans the sky, ensuring dawn looks benign, almost parental. Smoke and eucalyptus still perfume the air. Behind him, Mia sleeps beneath a quilt pastel dust on her cheek, like war paint repurposed for peace. Whisper grazes nearby. Each mouthful sounds like paper turning in a quiet library. When the bell clangs, newcomers stir from tents blinking as though surprise holds weight. Some drove all night for the rumor that a horse here listens better than any doctor. They converge where Elise Thornton pours coffee dark as creek water. Beside the pot stands a wooden box labeled Right Why. Inside lie rolled white ribbons, finger-wide bone pail. Mia shuffles over. Her wrist still bears a faint leather shadow, but her eyes gleam like antique glass. She unrolls a ribbon and writes 4 words, "I choose the next." She knots it and slips it into her pocket. Koa carves an ironbark stake. Hammering it beside the main gate, he creates the first anchor for a perimeter of declarations. Harper strings fresh rope. Sala sets a folding table with pens tied by twine so wind cannot steal them. Hana approaches, palms damp. She carries a vial with the solitary LED salvaged from her dismantled sensor, pulsing every 20 seconds. On her ribbon she writes, "To learn without possession." She knots the vial inside the cloth and ties it to the rope. Something unclenches in her spine. She laughs softly, startled by the sound. The line swells. A widower pens to hear her laugh again. A veteran records 3 initials of fallen brothers. Children need help spelling bravery, so Koa bends to phonetic whispers and prints letters large enough for wind to read. Elise trims loose threads, letting each ribbon flutter clean. Sunlight glosses Whisper's flank. He lifts his head, sensing electric intention. Without cue, he begins a slow pilgrimage toward the fence. Conversations hush. People part inhaling as one. Whisper halts at the gate. Jacob steps aside. The stallion enters the lane of fluttering cloth circles, once then selects a post painted gold by sun. He bows muzzle near a cluster of ribbons. Time freezes inside that gesture. Mia kneels, tying her words directly to the bridle draped across Whisper's neck. White on white, the message vanishes, unless you stand close enough to feel breath. Whisper rises, ribbon fluttering like a new vein, then paces the perimeter carrying the portable gospel of survival. At the end of the circle he pauses, looks back a final benediction, before slipping into shade. Jacob wipes his eyes, learning water obeys gravity without shame. He rings the bell to open the art tent. Inside, Mia unveils a canvas taller than she is, pigments mixed from pasture mud and donated oils. It shows a fence looped in white ribbons, stretching into a yellow sunrise. Near the horizon, stand a girl and a horse, facing endless light. Gasps ripple. Viewers recognize themselves in abstract shapes blooming across mid-distance. Hana sees her outline washed thinner. Koa spots a carved knife hidden in shadow. Elise touches thick paint and hears a heartbeat frozen in pigment. "This will travel farther than any of us," she whispers. A reporter arrives with camera ready. Jacob sets one rule: film. The fence filmed the festival, but ask no one why they wrote. Reasons are gifts, not content. The reporter nods, subdued by what she can't name. Lunch is stew with lemon myrtle served in banana leaf bowls. Strangers share bread like communion. A teen strums guitar. Koa adds woodblock. Harper threads harmony. Wind carries the melody up hills where shepherds feel chest pressure without knowing why. Afternoon brings workshops. Sala teaches first aid. Elise leads breathing matched to Whisper's stride. Hana hosts data as poetry, turning pulse readings into haiku. A child writes beat between tears. Numbers whisper, "I am here." Math becomes mother. Applause rises. Hana feels diplomas crumble into confetti. As sun tilts west, ribbons multiply into a white wave. Jacob imagines satellite images 1 year from now. Tasmania wearing a fringe of reasons to stay alive. Golden light wakes Whisper. He strolls back steps to the crossing of 3 ropes and lowers his head. 5 breaths deep in his chest. On the 6th, he lifts and nods once slower than sunset, heavier than verdict. Tears answer in silence. Mia laughs lighter than dusk. She raises her painting so light within light glows. The reporter captures a single frame hope rendered twice on canvas and in faces. The assembly inhales together. In that vacuum, 4 hoofbeats thud, then cease. Whisper's tail flicks once. Stillness settles like dew. Jacob dims lanterns. Koa taps drumstick thrice. Elise blows one clear conch note. Night swallows the valley, the white ribbon fence glowing under moon, as if brushed with phosphor. A crane shot pullback were there. One would rise above dark string lights over hoofprints braided like DNA over tense-lit amber. Fence and candles form a necklace encircling trauma, then blur into a pale constellation shaped like a human heart. Mia signs her painting with a daisy spiral. Whisper nudges her elbow. She leans into his shoulder and murmurs words, only night records. He flicks an ear decoding. Jacob walks the perimeter with a lantern, pauses at the post, where Whisper left the bridle. I choose the next, flutters in starlight. 7 syllables like a wave's breath. Leather feels warm under his fingers. Hannah stands by the river, watching ripples where her censer sank. Circles radiate like applause. Turning toward lanterns and the glowing fence, she feels unwritten data pulse in her chest. As afternoon deepens, candles added along the fence make ribbons tremble like stars. An immigrant nurse pins her visa denial. Stay for patience, and exhales. 2 brothers once estranged read each other's ribbons and hug. Mia guides children painting Whisper silhouettes. A 6-year-old asks how to paint a nod. Like asking the sky to keep going, she says. Tiny brushes emulate the gesture. Sala and Harper create the listening bench, sit a minute in shared silence. An accountant leaves his pocket watch behind, now tied to the fence at the exact minute he chose to stay. The reporter sketches instead of filming. Her future headline will read, "A place you feel before you see." At dusk, Koa's wattle-scented fire leads a gratitude circle. Hannah joins. Counting breaths, surrenders to rhythm. Stars bloom. Jacob's old projector shows Whisper's life, each slide fading to white. Lantern light reflects off wet eyes. Elise ties her hospital bracelet and a ribbon thank you for the second sunrise high, where wind is strongest. The fence has become a wind chime of survival tokens. Whisper lies in the paddock's center. People gather around him. Koa hums Dreamtime melody. Harper adds harmony. Whisper rises boughs deepest yet. Mia seals her canvas with one last stroke, then signs again. Candles dwindle. Ribbon fence glows. Mia traces cloth with fingertips, memorizing the tableau for dark nights. Back at the bunkhouse, Jacob watches Whisper sleep. Hannah repeats the new creed, presence is the unit of care. Wind plays the ribbon sending reasons skyward. Before sleeping, volunteers place a ledger on the welcome table, inviting each guest to inscribe tomorrow's intention. Some pledge to phone a sibling, others to plant seedlings. One vows to taste apricots again. Mia writes, paint the sound of water. Elise adds, return with friends, not ready yet. Jacob's entry spans 3 words, keep the gate, while Hannah fills a page describing research built on consent, wonder, and silence. By lantern light, they read each promise aloud, stitching another layer onto the fence of resolve together.